It's Encounter on the Voice of America. Encounter on the Voice of America brings together advocates and opponents debating the critical issues of our time in a freewheeling, no-holds-barred discussion of fact and opinion. With today's guests and the topic for Encounter, here is Castiel.
Welcome to Encounter on the Voice of America. On this edition of the program, Leadership Transitions in Ethiopia and Somalia. Hello again. I'm your host, Castiel. In Ethiopia, Haile Mariam Desalegn was recently sworn in as Prime Minister. He replaces longtime Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, who died of an undisclosed illness in August at the age of 57. Mr. Haile Mariam pledges to continue Mr. Meles's policies on the economy and after decades of warfare, Somalia has been undergoing a peace and national reconciliation process with a series of landmark steps to bring an end to the Horn of Africa nation's 8-year political transition. These steps include the adoption of a provisional constitution, establishment of a new parliament, and the selection of a new president. In August, Somalia swore in its first parliament since 1991. The country inaugurated its newly elected president, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, a moderate political activist and academic, in September. He heads a fledgling government that replaces the internationally backed transitional administration. However, the euphoria surrounding the transition was soon dampened by an assassination attempt on the president and a series of suicide attacks on civilians and a member of parliament by Al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda-linked group that has lost most of its territory, but is still capable of launching assaults using hit-and-run, guerrilla-style tactics. Well, joining me to discuss the political transitions in both Ethiopia and Somalia and prospects for stability are Ambassador David Shin and Jennifer Cooke. Ambassador David Shin is former U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia and Burkina Faso, currently a professor of international affairs at George Washington University. He blogs at the official blog of Ambassador David Shin, and Jennifer Cooke. She's the director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's a policy group based here in Washington. Jennifer Cooke previously worked for the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee and for the National Academy of Sciences. And both panelists join me here at the VOA Broadcast Center in Washington. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, you, Carol.
Well, Ambassador Shin, let me begin with you. First to Ethiopia. How would you characterize the legacy of former Prime Minister Meles Zenawi?
I think there are several parts to that legacy, both domestic and international. On the domestic side, he leaves a very strong legacy of economic development, and one that I'm sure the new leader will hope to carry through on. The GDP growth rate, even on a per capita basis, was in the vicinity of 7-8% in the last 5-6 years. That's quite impressive. There also has been enormous amount of infrastructure construction in the country. Also on the domestic side, there is a legacy of a slow pace of democratization, some setbacks, some criticisms on the human rights side, and that's an area where many of us hope that the new leadership will make efforts to improve what has been going on in Ethiopia. On the international side, particularly the regional side, Meles Zenawi leaves a record of significant engagement in regional problems, and for the most part in a positive way. One could argue about some of the earlier steps in Somalia, but certainly his efforts in Sudan have been of a positive nature, trying to reconcile the governments in Khartoum and Juba, with some success in that direction. Also engagement further afield during his 21 years in office, where he has contributed peacekeeping troops. So I think it's overall a positive legacy on the international side.
Turning to you, Jennifer Cooke, what would you add or subtract to that assessment?
Well, I think that's exactly right. It's something of a mixed legacy. He brought stability to Ethiopia after a horrific regime under the Derg. The economic progress has been pretty phenomenal, but there has been an increasing limitations on political space, on freedom of expression, on freedom of assembly. The 2005 elections, in which the opposition made some important gains, was then met with pretty brutal tactics from the government. And as I talked to Ethiopians here in Washington the day after he died, and I said, what are you thinking? One said he was a tyrant and now we may have an opportunity. And another said, my heart is breaking. We don't know what comes next. So it's very mixed altogether. I think that's right on the international scene. Meles was an extremely shrewd, smart, visionary person with a vision of development and kind of a global statesman. He was very much at ease in a global forum and in an African forum. And I think Ethiopia, in that way, the profile of Ethiopia was much higher than it might have been. It's a fairly poor state, but I think Meles has really put it on the map.
Back to you, Ambassador Shin. What do we know about the new Prime Minister, Haile Mariam? To what extent will he, in fact, continue policies and perhaps go further, as you suggested, to make significant changes with respect to greater democracy, freedom of expression, things that Meles Zenawi was criticized about?
Well, we actually know quite a bit about him. He's been around for a considerable period of time. He began really as an academic. He has a PhD in water resources management. He then went into politics. I believe he joined the EPRDF in 1999, but he has been involved in Southern politics for a longer period than that. He joined the staff of the Prime Minister Meles and became an advisor on social matters, and then became ultimately Foreign Minister and Deputy Vice President. So he has a track record. Where he goes from here, of course, is the important part. He's very smart. He's personable. He is someone who I think will listen to other ideas. It remains to be seen how much he is his own person. There are obviously very strong people around him who have probably some differing ideas as to how to move forward, and it remains to be seen whether in the next 2 years anyway, his term at least will go through 2015, whether he can exert some of his own ideas if he bumps up against positions that are entrenched in a different direction.
Back to you, Jennifer Cooke. What do you think the new Prime Minister might do differently? Will there be quite a bit of continuity, but will he, do you think, respond to some of the desires for greater freedom of expression, assembly, those kinds of things for which Meles Zenawi was criticized, the human rights front?
I think he's going to have a difficult time. I mean, he does have a track record, but he's not a particularly high-profile person within Ethiopia or externally. The Ethiopian government, or the party in power, is actually a coalition of parties. And Meles Zenawi's party, the TPLF, was really, really dominant within that. And kind of his close cohorts who fought alongside him back 22 years ago. I think there's going to be a lot of jostling within that coalition to see, is it our turn now to lead it? And I think Haile Mariam is going to be buffeted by that and may not want, at this point, to kind of open up the political space too much. So I think there'll be jostling within the ruling coalition, and then the opposition may see this as an opportunity in the next few years to kind of regroup, recoalesce as they did in 2005 and really push the political agenda. So he may not be in a position to be opening things up and to be really steering the country in a new direction.
Back to you, Ambassador Shin. Jennifer Cooke brought up the opposition. Could you discuss for us who are they and how much of the population do they represent? And to what extent, will they play a greater role perhaps going forward?
Well, we certainly saw in 2005 where the opposition represented a significant component of the population. They claimed at the time that their coalition had actually won the election. I think that's perhaps questionable. They, I think, did better than what their numbers suggested coming out of that election, but I'm not sure I would go so far as to suggest that they actually had the numbers to win the election. Since 2005, their strength has been enormously reduced for both reasons of what the EPRDF has done to make it difficult for them to exist in the country and what they have done to themselves. They've always been divided and only agreed upon one feature, that is the defeat of the EPRDF. And beyond that, they don't really agree on that much. And if they were to win an election, and since they are largely ethnically based, my concern is that they would start going off in a variety of different directions, even in the aftermath of victory. But before they even reach that point, they have to coalesce in a fashion that presents a program, a platform, if you will, to the Ethiopian people that is different than the EPRDF platform, and then sell it and convince the people that they have something better to offer. And they're a long ways from doing that yet.
Back to you, Jennifer Cooke. Would you agree with Ambassador Shin that the opposition basically stands for defeating the ruling Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or the EPRDF? Or do they have another platform? What do they really stand for?
Well, they are very divided. So, as Ambassador Shin said, the one thing that unites them is this dislike of the EPRDF and the wish to remove them.
Do they dislike them for ideological reasons, philosophical, or is it more personal?
Well, I think it's a question of ethnic-based politics and regional politics as well, and then to a certain extent the human rights and democracy record. You know, I wouldn't say that every opposition group is going to be any more democratic than Meles was, but many of the opposition groups have different agendas, and some may be more focused on the democratic, some may on the economic front. But I don't think there is a cohesive vision that they have of a different tack to take in Ethiopia than the EPRDF.
Before we go to a break, back to you, Ambassador Shin. Any implications for U.S.-Ethiopian relations with the transition in power, and to what extent will Ethiopia continue to play a very important role in the region vis-a-vis Somalia, Sudan, and elsewhere?
Generally speaking, I think the relationship will remain about the same as it was under Meles Zenawi. The one area that I would be somewhat concerned about would be the degree to which the new government and new leaders are interested in engaging in regional issues, and beyond that, international issues. You will remember that Meles Zenawi was the Africa representative for climate change. I'm not sure that I see the new leadership having those kinds of international interests, or even a sufficient understanding of those kinds of issues to take on that kind of a task. I think they will stay very engaged in Somalia because they see Somalia almost as an internal security issue. So I don't see any significant change there. The issue I would worry more about in terms of a positive Ethiopian contribution would be Sudan and South Sudan, where under Meles Zenawi, there was an enormous amount of engagement behind the scenes, and as I say, it was generally positive. I just don't know as though the new folks are going to have that much time or interest to engage in something like North and South Sudan.
And back to you, Jennifer Cooke. What is your assessment with respect to regional cooperation and U.S.-Ethiopian relations?
Well, I think, again, the secession process is not yet over. You've got an election coming up in 2015. As I said, there may be jostling within the ruling party. And while they may stay engaged in Somalia and in Sudan and South Sudan, their attention may be distracted, and there may not be kind of the forceful, authoritative leadership that Meles brought in their engagement in those. And you may see a slight drawing back in terms of attention, focus, and coherence. There may be an opportunity with the new government on finally ending Eritrea-Ethiopia stalemate. Meles had a very strong stake in that. Some observers say that there may be kind of a ripeness there at this point, and they may be more open to that. In terms of U.S. engagement, I think, we have such a strong security relationship with Ethiopia that I don't think the U.S. government is going to do much different. I think they will encourage and press Haile Mariam to take on some political reforms in terms of the political liberties, freedom of speech, expression, kind of the repression of journalists and so forth. But I think there'll be a lot of continuity there. Because of the security stakes, the U.S. really wants to see a stable transition and not a chaotic one. And that's, I think, their principal interest at this point.
You're listening to Encounter on the Voice of America. My guests are Ambassador David Shin, former U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia and Burkina Faso. He's currently a professor of international affairs at George Washington University. And Jennifer Cooke, from whom you just heard. She's director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. I'm Carol Castiel. We're talking about political transitions in Ethiopia and Somalia. And here's a shout out to Samatar Ibib Ibrahim from Djibouti, who is currently based in Sudan. This is a reminder that you can listen to Encounter online as a podcast, and we are expanding into webcasts. please visit our website at voanews.com/encounter. You may also follow me on Twitter at Carol Castiel, VOA. And as always, please send your comments and feedback to encounter@voanews.com. Well, back to you, Ambassador David Chin. Let's go now to Somalia. Until recently, the transition looked rather hopeful, al-Shabaab being on the wane and so forth, the new parliament, new president, and then, of course, the assassination attempt, suicide attacks in Mogadishu, killing journalists, a member of parliament. What do you make of this? Is this the last gasp for al-Shabaab, or is it a sign that they're continuing to wreak havoc? Are they back? How do we interpret these events?
The assassination attempts in Mogadishu, which have been pretty shocking this past month, do not indicate that al-Shabaab is in its last gasp, but it is a desperate move. This is not the activity of an organization that is gaining membership and gaining strength. It's one that is frankly on the run, but far from being defeated. The al-Shabaab movement is not ingratiating itself with most Somalis by carrying out these attacks. The recent suicide bombing in the restaurant in Mogadishu killed 18 people. Most of them were just innocents. Most of them had nothing to do with the government. There were 3 journalists included in that group. So they're still very much of a threat, and it does put a shadow over the new government. I still remain quite optimistic about this new government in that it at least offers the opportunity for significant change in Somalia if it can get through these security challenges from al-Shabaab, and if it can eschew corruption. And if it cannot deal with the corruption problem, I have no hope for it. But I'm encouraged that it may be able to break through both of those issues, and if it does that, then it may be able to build much wider support among the Somali people.
Turning to you, Jennifer Cooke, for your interpretation of recent events and to what extent you think that the al-Shabaab is doing this in a desperation attempt, but still they're a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, I think they are definitely getting squeezed with the Kenyan intervention, the Ethiopian intervention, the African Union troops within Mogadishu. And so they've certainly lost territory, and with territory also the revenues that they were getting from local populations and business people. But, the fact is al-Shabaab's strength lies in its ability to disrupt, and that was their initial strength and their initial threat, and they still have that. It doesn't take a whole lot within Mogadishu to make things very difficult for a ruling government. I share Ambassador Shin's thoughts on the government. I mean, they have a very short window to prove that they are something different, I think, both to Somalis and to the international community. They replaced a predatory government that was extremely corrupt, delivered nothing in terms of services and security. So there's a pretty low bar to be an improvement over that, but they don't have a long time to demonstrate that. And that's the key, I think, to the longer-term Somalia problem. Shabaab has been squeezed and may be on the run, but the question has always been, what replaces Shabaab? Do we just leave a vacuum? If the government and local governments aren't able to kind of create basic security and services, you'll have a vacuum that 5-10 years down the line, we have this problem all over again. And it's been kind of cyclic within Somalia that way.
Back to you, Ambassador Shin. What do you think are the obstacles preventing this new government, albeit it's a very fledgling government, from getting a handle on security? To what extent are the obstacles within? Are they not getting enough support from the outside? Who are the other partners and so forth?
Well, a key issue is the degree to which the militias, the military, if you will, of the new government have been properly trained and paid regularly, and how loyal they are. And I don't have a real good feel for that at the moment. My impression is that they're doing much better in that regard. At the same time, an awful lot of the pressure on al-Shabaab has come from the AMISOM forces, from the Kenyan forces who are now part of AMISOM in the lower Juba, and from the Ethiopian forces who are operating across the border inside Somalia who are not part of AMISOM. And if it were not for them, Shabaab would be in a much stronger position than it is. But Shabaab is weakening. I think that's indisputable. And it's important that the new government take advantage of that weakness. But now it's mainly a political issue. You have to continue to squeeze al-Shabaab from a security point of view, but it's up to the new government to prove to the Somali people that it has something useful to offer, that it can provide government services, and that it can provide an element of security. And that's going to take some time yet.
Back to you, Jennifer Cooke. Do you think the new government has a plan to tackle these security issues? And if so, what is it?
Well, to my knowledge, they haven't articulated a strategy. I think that remains to be seen. Let me just say that I think the international community has done Somalia no favors to a large extent. The support to the previous government was pretty much unfettered by any conditionality. Those funds were misused to an egregious degree. 70% of international funding reportedly was gone into corruption, gone into individuals funding their own militias and so forth. I think we have to be very careful in how we engage this government. Every international intervention in Somalia has unintended consequences and skews incentives in ways that we don't predict and that can often be very counterproductive. So I think as we engage with this government, we're going to have to set, I think, more clear conditionalities on that assistance. Otherwise, the possibility of creating, again, an unproductive incentive mechanism, I think, is very high.
Back to you, Ambassador Shin. You said that you were relatively optimistic if the new government could tackle both the security challenges and corruption. How optimistic are you that in light of these current attacks, does that weaken the president? How optimistic are you that he can muster the support? And what is the role of the militias, not the al-Shabaab base, but other clan militias? Are they going to cooperate?
I think the signs so far on the other clan militias are fairly positive. They seem to be willing to give this new government a chance. And even the al-Shabaab suicide attacks, where they may have some short-term advantages for al-Shabaab or benefits, I think in the long term they are increasing to alienate al-Shabaab from the Somali people. I think they're going to harm al-Shabaab over the longer term. They're not gaining any friends with these suicide bombings. So I'm relatively optimistic that this government, at least for the first time in many years, has the possibility of turning the corner. I did not feel that way 3-4 weeks ago. I didn't see any possibility of turning the corner the way the process was going. But I've basically changed my approach to this. It doesn't mean it's going to work, but at least it has a possibility of working now.
Jennifer Cooke, how optimistic are you, given what's been going on? I mean, that this new president, what basis would you have for remaining optimistic or not? And again, the role of the militias that aren't affiliated with al-Shabaab, how are they going to be incorporated into a much more centralized and effective security force?
Yeah, it's always a bit dangerous to be optimistic on Somalia, given what's happened over the last 18 years and kind of government after government, all transitional government after government, kind of failing to do what it needs to do to govern and provide security and integrate and become a truly national governing force. Again, I think it's a new set of leaders at this point. Again, they were appointed by appointees, and so there's some question about how legitimate they are in the eyes of many Somalis. But there will be a willingness to give them a period to prove themselves, but it will be short. And yeah, it's an opening, and it's really going to be a question of whether Somalis and this new government and Somali citizens are going to take advantage of it. Again, with the Kenyan intervention, Ethiopia and Amazon, you do have much more kind of engaged regional community that I think can help provide a buffer and perhaps logistic help to the government and local governments that hasn't been there before. Again, I'd say extremely cautiously optimistic.
Back to you, Ambassador Shin. So AMISOM will continue to play a role, the UN-based peacekeeping force, and of course the African Union. What other actors will be involved? And what about the United States? How do you see the U.S. role going forward, given the new government?
I think the international community generally, and the United States in particular, will continue to offer funding for this new government to help to continue to train its military forces. And that's been very much of an international effort, not just an American effort. That will go forward. I would tend to agree with Jennifer. I think the international community has made a lot of missteps in Somalia in the past. And this is an occasion where it's time to back off somewhat. Let the new Somali government decide for itself what direction it wants to go and how it should get there. The international community should respond to legitimate requests for assistance, and where we know that the money is going to be used or will be used without getting involved in corruption. And beyond that, I would back off for a while and just see where this new government can take it.
Would you agree, Jennifer, with that assessment?
Yeah, again, I think in the transitional federal government, the United States felt this is the only game in town. We have to support these guys no matter how corrupt they are. And the transitional federal government knew that and so was able to act essentially with impunity and still continue to get funds. So I do think, again, more conditionality, but I agree, give them a little bit of space to prove themselves, to build the kinds of alliances and broaden their political base. Another factor is other members of the international community are getting involved. Turkey, for example, has established an embassy there, is doing some development work. There are Turkish development and political folks within Mogadishu, and I think that's kind of a positive sign. The coalition of people helping Somalia is broadening, not just from Kenya, Ethiopia, and AMISOM and the traditional donors, but kind of new donors as well.
Ambassador Shin, to close, would you say that it's fair to say that if we see greater stability in Somalia, that will spill over into other parts of the region, even perhaps Yemen? What are the implications of Somalia's growing stability, if indeed that occurs?
Well, they're enormous for the entire region, including Yemen, obviously including Kenya and Ethiopia, the Swahili Coast area where al-Shabaab has been successful in obtaining recruits, and perhaps even in Somaliland, obviously, and even further than that, perhaps it will have some lessons for places like South Sudan. That may be a bit of a stretch, but I wouldn't rule that out.
And the last word to you, Jennifer Cooke. I know we're waxing rather optimistic, but we know what an unstable Somalia can do to the region. So what are the implications, in your view, of a greater stability in Somalia? Do you see these kinds of effects on the region in a positive way?
Absolutely. If you can get a modicum of stability in Somalia, it sets a tremendous precedent for what is possible. I mean, it's been written off so long as kind of hopelessly intractable. And I think that would send a powerful signal, as Ambassador Shin said, to South Sudan and further afield in these kind of very intractable conflicts.
Well, on that optimistic note, we will conclude and hope that we can be right this time on Somalia. I'd like to thank my guests, Ambassador David Shin. He's former U.S. Ambassador to Ethiopia and Burkina Faso, and Jennifer Cooke. She's Director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks so much to both of you for taking time to come in, and as always, sharing your terrific insights.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Encounter was produced in Washington. Thanks to Anna Zalewski for booking our guests. Our engineer was Greg Burns. And I'm Carol Castiel. Join me again next week for another Encounter on the Voice of America.
Encounter on the Voice of America. Encounter on the Voice of America brought together advocates and opponents debating the critical issues of our time in a freewheeling, no-holds-barred discussion of fact and opinion. Your host was Carol Castiel. Join us again next week for another Encounter on the Voice of America.